Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this review I'm going to be looking at the Fate World Books 2, Worlds in Shadows. Now, the introduction to this book is very similar to the previous Fate Worlds book, Worlds on Fire. Please see my previous review, link down below. Aside from the capsule descriptions of the mini campaigns. Now, the aim of this book is to showcase a number of settings, each of which do something unusual or innovative with the Fate rules. Now, I'll mainly be reviewing the book based on this idea. It's 260 odd pages long, and the PDF costs $7.50 on DriveThruRPG, which is, I believe, about £5 in British money. The artwork inside the book is a mix of the cartoon style seen in the previous Fate core books, along with some photographic pieces, which put me in the mind of the old Mind's Eye Theatre books from White Wolf. All of which is perfectly serviceable and does the job that it's intended to do. Nothing really jumps out at me about the artwork in the book, but it's all absolutely fine. And it is all black and white. We start off with the first campaign setting, which is Crime World by John Rogers, and that deals mainly with the idea of performing cons or heists. And there's an interesting opening discussion regarding the difficulty of pinning down exactly what the heist slash film noir slash con genre is. And the author decides to provide a more generic way of representing this sort of scenario that you could pretty much cut and paste from here into any game, and that's obviously a good thing. There's a useful list of crime world lingo and terminology, which will be useful for any game where there's a lot of criminal dealings going on. You can pepper such phraseology about to add an air of authenticity to any game like that. The law skill is repackaged as expertise, and it represents knowledge about the job. A new skill called information is created, which deals with the discovery of accurate information as well as the dissemination of misinformation. All very useful skills within the criminal enterprise. Crime World discusses how you should go about setting up a crime story, with emphasis on players pulling off a con or a heist. It recommends setting up the problems that the players will deal with in the following way. In order to achieve a certain goal, we need to carry out a certain sequence of actions. But in order to keep the scenarios interesting, it introduces a little wrinkle where the most obvious method of achieving this goal would result in fallout or consequences which are far worse than the original problem. One of the examples given in the book is, in order to wreak vengeance on the high priest, we need evidence of his sins. However, if we confront him directly, the church will destroy us. And I think this is a great no-nonsense way to get the broad details of a game session bolted down, and the additional wrinkle adds an extra layer of role-playing interest without unduly heaping additional complications onto the actual production of the scenario. The next part of Crime World is probably the most interesting for me, and it discusses creating your score, which is the desired item or information, the mark, whoever controls access to the score, and the box, which is the security that just stops people walking in, taking the score, and being about their merry way. And each of these three elements is a collection of aspects and skills. The game goes into some detail about what sorts of aspects and skills are appropriate within a crime world game, and this section makes a very interesting reading, and it's very thought-provoking. No doubt it will be of use to anyone playing a game involving criminal enterprises or that sort of hijinks. Crime World then goes into some more detailed advice for running a heist con scenario, all of which is well written and interesting to read. In addition, the author admonishes the prospective Crime World GM to ensure that the plans of his opposition make sense and would have succeeded were it not for the intervention of the player characters. And I think this is a very good point, and it avoids that almost inevitable moment at the end of a scenario where the plans of the opposition are revealed and the players sit around scratching their head saying, well, how were we supposed to know that? All in all, a very compelling campaign setting with a lot to add to any game involving criminal enterprises. We move on to the next mini campaign, which is Time Works by Mark Diaz Truman, which deals with covert time traveling adventures. And this begins with some corporate paperwork and some small post-it add-ons admonishing the reader not to trust the company. This sets up the mood of the piece, sort of corporate espionage and paranoia, quite nicely. Now, I've always been interested in the theory of time travel. I've got a number of GURPS supplements about it and other game supplements and lots of films that cover the subject, a lot of which are actually quoted as inspiration at the end of Timeworks. So I was quite interested to see what the author would do with this idea. Now, the IC transcripts that are dotted throughout this section of the book, which include several redacted or blacked out sections, remind me very much of the corporate feel of Orpheus, produced by White Wolf, one of their limited game lines, which elsewhere in my channel I've listed as one of my favourite roleplay games of all time. So that's a good thing. However, one thing I would say about these IC transcripts is there seems to be an awful lot of them in a section in a book that only occupies a limited space, and I just wonder if the space couldn't have been put to better use. However, having said that, it's all very flavoursome and gets you in the mindset of the setting. The setting proposes the idea that certain major temporal events are set in stone and have a certain temporal gravitas to them. When, if you alter minor events, the timeline will shift and accommodate what you have done in order to end up with ostensibly the same results. But perfecting any major alteration to the timeline is extremely difficult. And I think this is a good compromise to prevent a time travel adventure from just completely derailing a game and removing any sense of consistency from it, which, having run games with time traveling before, it's very easy to fall into that trap. And whilst offering unlimited possibilities and unlimited changeability to a timeline may seem like a good idea at the start, having no consistency whatsoever leads to frustrated players who aren't really able to get a grasp of what their characters can do and what the aims of the campaign setting are, because there is no consistency. So I think Timeworks is offering an ideal compromise here. Agents of Timeworks also go through a process called de-alignment, where they are severed from the time stream, becoming divorced from the consequences of their own past history. This is a really nice way of handling that whole grandfather paradox thing, where if you go back in time and kill your grandfather, you wouldn't have existed, you wouldn't have been born, so therefore how could you have gone back and killed your grandfather, in which case he wouldn't have died and you would have existed, etc., etc. By being divorced from your time stream, to use the example above, you could go back and kill your grandfather. However, it would have no effect on your actual character, since you are no longer connected to the ebb and flow of events. You exist only in the present. The in-game fluff does caution against travel into the future, stating that operatives cannot be received and pulled back from the future, and that those they have sent into the near future with orders to make contact with base camp have not done so. So the game's very clearly putting a lid on any potential sort of interactions with the future, and it's more about interacting with the past. However, that could be easily altered or changed if your personal preference involves travel into the future. So I don't think that's a major flaw in the setting. The character genning section is well written and follows a standard Fate mold, with the addition of an anchor, a single item possessed by de-aligned agents, which helps remind them of the timeline they originated from. Since they have been de-aligned, without this anchor, it's easy to drift and become lost and separated from the memories of your own timeline. And operatives who lose their anchor begin to suffer mental stress as they start to lose track of their own history. However, those who possess an anchor gain great sort of mental fortitude from it, and it can be used to refresh your pool of fate points. There is a list of new skill trappings and stunts, all of which relate to time travel and fit in very well with the setting. The most interesting part of the setting for me is the concept of using the Fate Fractal, which is the concept that anything within a game can be generated as a character with aspects, skills, and stunts, to build a timeline with its own high concept, the definition of the timeline, and a trouble, which is a different from the present that is going to cause issues or complications for the player. Each timeline should have its own issues reflecting the political and social issues of the day, which the player characters want to interact with in their plot. There's also a brief discussion on using timeline aspects, and that failing to accept a compel from a timeline aspect not only costs you a fate point, but it draws the attention of the shadow men, who are like mysterious temporal enforcers that aren't strictly defined by the game. There are some stats given at the end, but their origin is left deliberately hazy so that the individual GM can tweak them to fit their own version of the setting, which is something I think is a good idea. The campaign suggests using milestones, which are the advancement or XP system of Fate, to model how changes to the timeline can be achieved, with players having to achieve a number of lesser milestones or steps before reaching their goal of changing the timeline, which is a more major milestone. Each timeline also has a stress tracker, like a normal character, and it takes stress or damage whenever a character makes one of these changes to it. This can result in the attentions of the shadow men being drawn towards you, or in more extreme cases, it can even result in the particular timeline becoming divorced from the main ebb and flow of temporality, making it impossible for time travelers to enter or leave that timeline, which could result in stranded player characters and no support coming from base camp. When this stress is accumulated, though, whenever these changes are made, there are certain operatives which are nicknamed holders who can minimize this disruption to the timeline by absorbing some of this stress, this damage, this temporal tinkering into themselves, taking that damage into their own person, but sparing the timeline from it. And each Timeworks team normally incorporates at least one or two of these people to minimize the disruption to the time stream. This section rounds off with some nice NPC stats and some sample stats for the mysterious shadow men, and it's very compelling. The game offers a sort of a Quantum Leap-esque sort of vague explanation to how time travel works, with people entering a chamber and being sent back in time, but it's loose enough so that if you wanted to define it a bit more, you wouldn't find any major contradictions within the setting. The next campaign setting offered in the book is The Ellis Affair by Lisa Steele, which is a 1920s international murder mystery set in the aftermath of the Yokohama earthquake. Apologies if I've not pronounced that correctly. The characters are tasked with finding out what happened to the missing Marine Major, Earl Ellis, whilst he was investigating a potential threat from Japanese forces in the Philippines, and while Lawrence Zemsch, a man who treated him for neurasthenia at an American naval hospital, suffered a mysterious mental collapse. This part of the book is more like a traditional adventure or scenario than a full campaign setting, and it's set approximately 20 years before World War II. The setting is laid out as a mystery to be solved and provides some sample characters that can be used, although it's clear that the players could make their own. However, there are some guidelines which suggest that a lack of certain skills or abilities may make this scenario much, much harder for a player party. Without going into too much detail of the plot, because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's actually going to play in it, this adventure is laid out as a timeline with more details being given to specific scenes, locations, and NPCs. The adventure is well written and it's fairly crammed with the best in pulp stereotypes that give it that sort of Doc Savage, two-fisted pulp action feel. My one concern is that if the adventure was ran as it is, out of the box, so to speak, it might seem a little railroady, and there are several boxes throughout the text that tell you when a character must have a certain piece of information, or they must know something by a certain point of the adventure. However, I'm sure this wouldn't be a major problem for anyone who's willing to finesse the basic outline a little. Although the adventure is good, the most compelling part of the section of the book for me was the section on mystery adventures in Fate, which discusses in detail how to run an investigative or mystery style scenario. It details how to lay out a trail of clues and organize information for your scenario. The hints and tips provided in this section are great, and they put me in mind of Kenneth Haight's Trail of Cthulhu, published by Pelgrane Press, where the emphasis is not so much on finding the clues, but interpreting them once you have found them and deciding what to do with that knowledge. This section will be extremely useful and should, in my opinion, be required reading for anyone thinking of running a mystery scenario in any game, not just Fate. And in fact, I've already recommended it to a friend of mine who's starting a Dresden Files game. This part of the book is rounded off with some useful info on 1920s forensics and a good starting list of potential research points. The next scenario is No Exit by Shoshana Kessock, which is a psychological horror set in a sentient apartment complex. And this section of the book begins with an icy piece of writing that conveys an introduction to the new apartment block by the management. It starts off in a warm and friendly tone. However, by the end of the writing, a little more sinisterness, a little more coldness has started to creep into the writing. And it's made very obvious by the handwritten scrawl, "Management lies, there is no exit," written underneath it. But I think it's almost a shame that the author felt the need to include the scrawl and make it that obvious, since the previous writing gets quite sinister near the end. I'm not really sure if it needed sort of ramming in people's faces that much. The start of the setting warns that some topics of horror may be too intense for some players and that discretion is advised. Whilst a certain amount of discretion in relation to real world phobias and issues is always advisable within a game, after all, we're all here to have fun, not ruin anyone's day, this section seems to be building itself up an awful lot. Let's hope the scenario delivers. The setting for the scenario is the East March Living Complex, a modern development, and specifically the newest building on the complex, which is Wesley House, and this is where the PCs live. The idea seems to be that the complex is this huge oppressive force that dominates the lives of the residents, squelching any attempt to leave or better themselves. It's an interesting idea, but ephemeral concepts such as this are often difficult to portray in RPGs. Character genning is fairly standard, with the exception that players must come up with an item to represent each phase of the character creation, and these items exist in their apartment, and they're a tangible physical tie to their memories and their experiences. For example, if the player came to the apartment following a breakdown after the death of his sister, then he might possess a locket with a picture of her or that once belonged to her. After these items are decided, the scenario goes on to discuss memories. The complex of fogs or hazes over the memories of the residents within, and the PCs only come into play clearly remembering one of their aspects or memories. The others are considered unreliable and are subject to some adjustment and change by the GM. A new skill called Clarity is posited, which allows the player to resist the blandishments and the lies that the apartment complex throws up in front of them to obscure their real past. A very interesting addition is suggested when invoking aspects, and this is the idea that when a PC invokes an aspect, the GM can offer them the choice of they can have the normal bonus to overcome an obstacle, or they can spend the fate point instead to trigger a specific memory based on that aspect. The revelation of this memory may then alter the aspect as their past comes into sharper focus. Characters can also sacrifice their items and associated memories in order to overcome really severe obstacles, but in doing so, they're giving up a part of themselves to overcome the immediate threat, and they ever fall more under the sway of the complex and the management. The game begins as the player characters receive a message or some kind of incident occurs that jogs the PCs from their woolly complacency and spurs their memories within them. Perhaps the letter is sent by the mysterious caretakers who exist to show the PCs the way and operate within the dictates provided by the management, but generally seem to want to help players out. There follows a list of NPCs and some more details about the complex, which is portrayed as a sort of mental purgatory where people remain happy as long as they're complacent and they don't question things too much. Once they do start questioning things, the little cracks in the facade and the illusion that the complex is creating start to show, and it becomes obvious that it's not actually a friendly apartment block, but it's more like a honey trap for the very souls of the residents that remain within. The section rounds off with a very compelling discussion on how to bring elements of psychological horror into your game. This is very good advice, and to be honest, I wish I'd read this before I ran my own God Machine game recently. I'll certainly be looking to run something like No Exit in the future. So, as I said earlier, No Exit built itself up with its talk about psychological horror and more mature topics and discretion. Did it live up to those expectations? By and large, I would say yes, it did. It's a very compelling setting and certainly something I'll be looking to run in the future. And there's a great deal of advice in there for anyone thinking of running any sort of horror with a psychological edge to it. Not just in the Fate game, however, some of the mechanics in there, such as the memory mechanics dealing with aspects, can be very easily cut and pasted into another game and will make a very interesting addition. The next scenario is called Courtship, and it's by J.R. Blackwell, which is an invasion body snatcher / politics mashup set in the court of Louis XV. Courtship proposes a setting where in 1754 a giant comet ship carrying alien colonists arrives on Earth. It gives a brief rundown of Versailles and the notable people therein, which is reasonably interesting and provides enough detail to be useful in a game set in this historical setting, but without getting too bogged down in the minutiae of it all. In the invasion of the growth details, it talks about things from the aliens' perspective, the intro to which is unfortunately, in my opinion, written in an icy style told from the point of view of the aliens. This doesn't really capture any feeling of menace to me, and at least in my mind, demotes the aliens somewhat to the status of rubbery B-movie props, but perhaps that's what the author was going for. Some of the details about the aliens, who effectively consume the internal organs of a human and use their skin as a disguise, are very interesting and extremely well written. However, I found the odd breaks back into this sort of alien, icy viewpoint and the almost sort of jokey style of it quite jarring, and in my opinion, it didn't really add anything to this section. Character genning is fairly standard, with some additional social courtly skills being introduced to reflect the social manoeuvrings that go on at Versailles. By far the most interesting part of this campaign for me is the portrayal of the court of Versailles and the use of a secret aspect to represent people playing their cards very close to their chest and attempting to wrangle other people's secrets out of them or persuade people to take them into their confidence. It's very compelling, and I think this is a great example of how Fate can be used to run a more courtly or a more social game. The aliens seem to have been included more as an afterthought. I can see that the intent might have been to secretly have someone be one of the aliens, and the idea is to use this social maneuvering to eventually discover who the alien is. But the somewhat conversational tones of the IC writing where the aliens are concerned doesn't really create the feeling of menace or hidden horror that I would have preferred from a body snatcher style scenario. However, that is just my personal opinion. I'm pretty sure that anyone planning to run a more social game will take a lot from it, and certainly if you're randomly running a game set in the court of Louis XV, you'll find a lot here that is extremely useful. The final section of the book is the campaign Camelot Trigger by Rob Wyland. Apologies if I've not pronounced your name right, Rob. And this is a mashup of Arthurian concepts, sci-fi and mecha. And let's face it, who doesn't love giant robots? Nobody. That's who. In Camelot Trigger, the player portrays the role of knights piloting mecha, which are called armor in the setting, and they're defending the Earth against Morgana, a rogue artificial intelligence intent on destroying humanity, with the aid of another AI called Merlin, who controls the dragon or warp gates in the Sol system. A resistance fighter called John Arthur leads the way in construction of the armor and has issued a rallying cry to fight against Morgana and her emergent forces, recruiting an inner circle of knights from the neo-feudal houses that rule the solar system to help him in his quest. There's a rundown of the solar system containing some interesting concepts like the aforementioned worm gates, massive warp gates in the shape of dragons' heads, and Project Mordred, which is a clone of Arthur with a digital intelligence loyal to Morgana. And there's some various other interesting twists on Arthurian lore in there as well. The setting writing does an excellent job of portraying a space age feudal society, complete with knight houses and questing heroes. Camelot Trigger adds an armor skill which is used specifically to pilot mecha. They also offer some associated stunts. There's some additional skills, and some of the existing ones have been reskinned to more fully fit in with the setting, and this is all detailed nice and straightforward. Now, we come to the Mecha Rules, and as interesting as the setting is, and it is, Camelot Trigger is a very mecha orientated setting, so it's either going to stand or it's going to fall on how well these rules work. In Camelot Trigger, mecha are divided into 5 locations, which roughly in a humanoid mecha cover the head, the front torso, the back torso, the arms, and the legs. Each slot gets 1 internal or external system, which is equipment that is bolted onto the mecha. The internal systems give you a higher skill level whilst you're wearing the armor. They boost your innate abilities, and external systems work very much like stunts, and they stack with internal systems elsewhere on the armor. A very large list of example internal and external systems is given, along with nice guidelines about how to make your own. And these cover such things as like wide area guns where you can make multiple attacks, to systems that boost your reflexes. And that's all very interesting. The armor doesn't have its own stress trap, which is one of the more entertaining elements I found. However, it can absorb stress at the cost of some of its systems shutting down. This is an interesting way to represent the mecha without having to keep track of yet another stress box. And as a player, you have to make the choice of, do you take any damage yourself? Do you incorporate it into your stress rate? Or do you sacrifice some of the capabilities of your mecha, effectively making yourself less potent in order to negate that damage, but keep your human pilot fully functional? The game then goes on to list important NPCs and provide some setting details on the different styles of armor slash mecha that are produced on the different planets of the solar system, all of which is very interesting reading. Now, normally this game wouldn't be the sort that would appeal to me, since the emphasis on equipment and gear isn't something I personally generally go for in a game. If you do, fair enough, fair play to you. However, it's not something I personally normally go for. However, I must say, by fusing the idea of a more traditional mecha-based game with a reflection of the Arthurian legends and concepts which you normally find more in a fantasy game, I think the author has really created something that's more than the sum of its parts, and it showcases what the best of a game mashup concept can be, where 2 disparate elements have been taken, and by combining them in an interesting way with a degree of thought and common sense, you've actually ended up with a final product that is far more interesting than either of these individual elements might have been, and is more unusual and therefore a little more attention grabbing. So, what are my conclusions regarding Fate Worlds 2 Worlds in Shadow? Well, when I first started reading Worlds in Shadow, I didn't think that I was going to enjoy it as much as its predecessor, Worlds on Fire, which I reviewed in my last video, link below. The settings just didn't really leap out at me at much. Nothing really grabbed hold of me and said, yeah, yes, you're going to really enjoy this. However, let me tell you now, I could not have been more wrong when it comes to this book. All of the campaign settings in this book contain some great advice sections about running their particular genre or theme, which are well worth reading, even if you don't intend to use the rest of the campaign. Some of the campaigns on their own are particularly compelling, and even the campaigns which I personally found a little less enjoyable or that I was less likely to run had certain elements in it that I thought were very useful and very professionally created and portrayed, and that could be incorporated into other games. So I think there's not a single campaign setting in this book that doesn't have something of value, particularly for people running Fate games. However, for those who aren't running Fate games, the advice sections are still very, very valuable. So I certainly give it the 2 thumbs up, and at the cost of approximately $7, which is about £5 in British money, you can't really go far wrong. I think both of the Fate Worlds books are extremely worthwhile reading. They're easy to get hold of, the layouts are very nice, and together as a set, they really showcase some of what the Fate core system is capable of. And I highly recommend that if you're even slightly interested in Fate, or you have an interest in any of the genres listed, that you certainly have a look at the PDFs and consider buying the hard copies. If you have any comments on either of the Fate Worlds books or this review, please leave them in the section below. I hope if you've enjoyed this review, you'll consider clicking on like this video and subscribing to my channel. Until next time, I look forward to reading what you write. Thanks very much for watching.